Good afternoon. For the last 30 plus years, I've been documenting humanity around the world in over 100 countries on 6 continents. Forgive me, I fear I'm not, my slides aren't on. And I've done so with this notion of celebrating diversity and unity, because what would the world be like if instead of being afraid of one another's differences, instead we were curious or in awe? This whole body of work ended up getting me invited to be the exhibitor at the World Peace Summit in Vancouver with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other Nobel laureates. And it was there that I learned about human trafficking. Now, I'd known that some trafficking existed. I assumed it to be sex. I assumed it to be low numbers. But when I heard about the enormity of the situation, I was fully throttled. I mean, my whole career is based on observing others, and yet I totally missed it. So I flew down to Los Angeles, and I met with the co-directors of Free the Slaves. And we decided to collaborate. So I would go around the world to many countries I had been before. And this time I would certainly see the skeletons in the closet. Because of this whole body of work that I'm going to share with you has been made over the last 10 years, I opened a foundation called a Human Thread Foundation. We promote human dignity by building awareness and supporting education to end human trafficking. So with that, I'm going to bring you on a journey. Mine on the front lines began in the brick kilns of Nepal in India. It was honestly like walking into Dante's Inferno. In temperatures of more than 130 degrees, men and women and children, all in a heavy blanket of dust, stacked bricks on their heads, one at a time, up to 18. Each brick weighs 3 or 4 pounds. The temperatures were so high that the abolitionists that I was with were vomiting and fainting. And my camera became too hot to even touch. So it stopped working. I'd have to run back to our cruiser and have the driver turn on the ignition and the air conditioning. And I would pass my camera under the cool air so as to revive it. And I thought, my camera's getting far better treatment than these people will. These people are forced to work countless hours a day, and the children are left on their own. In Lake Volta, there are thousands of children that are enslaved along its shores. When I got there, I had the abolitionists that I was with bring me down to the water's edge, and this is actually what I saw. You know, I assumed it was a family out there fishing, but no, it turns out all of them were enslaved. The older ones had been taken and trafficked when they were young, but now it's their job to look over the younger kids. Now they're forced to work, again, endless hours. They'd been working since 1 a.m, pulling in these huge nets. I met them at 5 a.m. When these nets are full, they can weigh upward of 1,000 pounds. They love children because children have small, nimble fingers, and they could pull out debris and mend the nets. But since they're in the water so much, they frequently get skin ailments. And further, they do not teach them how to swim. Lake Volta, being the largest man-made lake in the world, has skeletal tree limbs that rise up from beneath the surface. So as you might imagine, when they toss out those huge nets into the lake, they get caught on the tree limbs. So they literally take the little children and they toss them in the water to untether the nets. But there's hope, and this little guy's one of them. This is Kofi. Kofi was rescued from a fishing village, and he was at a shelter where he was being rehabilitated. Now, these kids need to learn how to be kids again, how to laugh, how to play. And I made this image at a well where he was bathing. But the beautiful news is 6 months after I returned home, I learned that he was reunited with his parents. And what's even better is his parents were given an education on how to spot trafficking. Because people don't fall into human slavery because they're stupid. They do so because they've been lied to. I look at him and I think, who will he become because someone took a stand for him? In Thailand, I was recently documenting the migrants coming mostly from Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia. They're forced to work on these boats under grim conditions. Some of them aren't even able to get on land for years at a time. In the Himalayas, I witnessed children carrying stone that weighs more than their body weight. Instead of being in school, they're forced to carry huge pieces of slate down the perilous mountainside to trucks below. And then I think, is this slate the slate that I have in my kitchen or in my bathroom? Because we all knowingly or unknowingly participate in slavery every day. Another type of forced labor is rock breaking. They take the big stone and pound them into smaller ones and smaller ones so that it becomes gravel, maybe that I have in my garden or in my driveway. In Asia, entire villages can be enslaved for generations at a time. This particular village was getting help from abolitionists that were working undercover. At one point, they gathered together and took a bus to meet a solicitor for advice. But somehow, the slaveholder caught wind of this, and when they returned to their village, it was burnt down. So while these people had very little, now they had nothing, and they became petrified and wanted to give up. But this woman in the center rallied, and she was like, yeah, we have nothing. We have nothing left to lose. And so, with the help of solicitors, they ended up getting a quarry lease of their own. And they do the same backbreaking work, but they do it in freedom, and they get paid for it. Further, their children are in school, and you could see from the light in their eyes and their clothing, which is very clean, that freedom works. In Ghana, I went hundreds of feet down illegal gold mines held together by slick tree limbs. When they go down, they only have a small flashlight tethered to their head, primitive tools, and a sack in the hope of filling it with stone containing gold. They are intended to be beneath the surface for 48 to 72 hours at a time. And when they come up, they're soaking wet. It's as though they've been in a pool of water, but it's just the human sweat and the hot underbelly of the earth. Once that stone is brought to the surface, it is transported to another site called a pounding site. They take the stone and put them in these big bends, and they bang it with these irons, and you could see the powder on its hands, so it becomes sandy. I was brought into some cabin restaurants, otherwise known as brothels, in Nepal, by women who had previously been enslaved in the sex industry. These are known as cabin restaurants. They are partitioned by plywood and curtains, and each one is numbered. So their job is to encourage the clients, or men, who come to purchase more food and alcohol. And in turn, they can do whatever they want to these women and children sexually. So they endure a tragedy at the hands of these clients. Sonagachi is a neighborhood in Calcutta. It may be the largest brothel in all of Asia, perhaps the world. It's a huge catacomb of alleyways filled with brothels. I was brought in by a young person who was a resident there and who shall forever remain anonymous. We visited some of the brothels, and After I had some time with them, I made these portraits. You can see or hear this woman and the buyer in the background, who, by the way, didn't even care that I was there. Sadly, though, I learned a few months later through email that her body had been found outside of the brothel. And what's worse, no investigation was put into her demise. So here we see that the value is really in what the enslaved person can earn for the trafficker, but there's no inherent value in the person themselves. They're disposable. We see trafficking everywhere, but also in the United States, where more than 100,000 children are sold into sex slavery every year. Recently, I've been working on a new body of work with the Galileo Foundation. I was following around some nuns known as the Talitha Kum. That means girl, rise. The Talitha Kum nuns work in more than 70 countries on the front lines of slavery. I was in Mexico with the nuns working with the caravans coming north. Now, the refugee crisis marries perfectly with traffickers, because people are on the move, people get lost from one another, they run out of money, they perish, they get sick, and the traffickers come in and they just go for the vulnerable members. The nuns go and lay clothing out to red light districts and even in bars to help girls. They bring them in directly off the streets if they arrive at their door and find safe houses for them to be rehabilitated. And in the southern part of Europe, there are a group of minors that these nuns were working with. They'd come from North Africa, and they had all been impregnated by strangers who raped them while they were being trafficked. Pope Francis launched this exhibition back in May and set aside these prints that he signed to be auctioned for charity to help them. Now, as you may note, I want to shine a light on slavery. When I was in the field, I'd bring a bundle of candles, and I would photograph people in their forced labor, but if I had a moment or two, I would make these portraits. Thank you so much for your time.